Hello, and welcome to The Regrettable Century. It is Chris and Jason today, and we've got a couple of special guests. We've got Daniel Tutt, who is a lecturer, philosopher, and writer who focuses on psychoanalytic theory and Marxist thought. He's written a few books, and that's why he's here, is to talk about one of them. But the other ones that he's written are Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, The Crisis of Initiation, and How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. And then we've got C. Derick Varn, who probably doesn't need any introduction on this podcast, but if you're joining us and hadn't heard of Varn before, he is also an educator and a author, but he's a poet and a podcaster as well. He has two collections of poetry out, Apocalyptics and Liberation.
Varn is kind of like the podcaster.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, like, as far as staying power goes on the left, who's been around longer that's still here? And it's still a leftist.
Doug Henwood, maybe?
Doug Henwood, maybe, yeah. Yeah, but he was doing radio. And he basically does radio shows that are on the internet. So, does that count, really? Anyway, the reason that Daniel and Varn are here are to talk about their new book, which is called The People Are Not One, Socialist Strategy After Left Populism, which is out on Revol Press. And, well, I guess we could get things started off by telling us, like, what is this book? What's it about? Like, what is your theory and why did you decide to write it?
I guess I could take the first stab. Wonderful to be here. Thank you guys for having us. Basically, the book came out of the sense that history is somehow creating what we call in the book a kind of inevitability of populism as sort of an ideological phenomenon that seems to be repeating and repeating on the left as a form of thinking class politics that is riddled with contradictions and it's a very reductive way of thinking about politics on the left. I mean, we're most familiar with it with the kind of ascension of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, but Varn and I decided to actually ask, well, sort of what's the true prehistory of populism? So we, as you know, in the second chapter, we go back to an assessment of late 19th century populist party and its relationship to the Debsian Socialist Party, and track the age of mass politics, how populism actually was a serious institutional party force in democratic politics for decades.
Right.
And so the book is sort of a diagnosis of the limits of the populist moment in our era, in our time. And we kick it off with Stuart Hall's really, I think, widely read thesis, which we sort of agree with, but we also have a lot of pushback on, of what's called authoritarian populism. Super interesting about Hall's idea there is that embedded in the Thatcherite neoliberal sort of hegemony of neoliberalism, the sort of turn to a finance-dominated capitalist system, the gutting of the labor union movement, massive privatization across industry and commodification of industries. Actually, Hall sort of prophetically, before Thatcher even came about, really said that this will intensify a populist conception of socialism. And this is sort of what we see. We see socialism and Marxism leaning on a kind of populist idea of the people, of the masses, of the third estate, if you will. And we have the sense that there's something about conceiving of the working class, of the masses, through a populist lens that's deeply inadequate. So that's where the impetus of the book comes, sort of in the sense of not wanting to fall back into the same trap, the sort of populist trap. We fully recognize how attractive populism is, or left populism can be. But I don't know, Derick, maybe what would you say? It's sort of like the easy way out, right? Like it sort of circumvents the problem of building a truly working class oriented politics, which is something we, of course, see as of utmost importance. So that's sort of the big picture, but I'll kick it to Varn to build on that.
Yeah, the history of this book is interesting. It started off as an essay that came out of us talking about the bizarre role of intellectuals and things, socialist, starting with the merger thesis. And the relation to populism is not obvious, except that, and we did not go into this in our book, actually, but it's something I've thought a lot about. The way that the Narodniki had a very strange relationship with the masses, quote unquote, where they both valorized them as the primary means and focus of politics, but also talked down to them and did their, to the people movement. And I started thinking about that in terms of its parallel in the United States, the American populist tradition, which I also think, and we didn't go into this very deeply in the book either, but had a interesting class basis of the sharecroppers in America. So like the strongest class base of the Populist Party were the sharecroppers. When that political economic category started becoming less and less relevant, the Populist Party immediately liquidated through William Jennings Bryan into the Democratic Party. And I was also thinking about the various attempts to do mass line politics, new democratic politics, from Chinese New Democracy and popular frontism, and how none of those things are populism, but they all just tended to end up there over and over again. And I think there's some contentions that Daniel and I make that are going to be pretty salacious to certain groups. Like, we include both obvious populist movements like Syriza, Podemos, Occupy, the Sanders and Corbyn movements, but also not so obvious things like analytical Marxism, communization theory, as also populist, because of their trying to get around class theory. And we wanted to look at this in terms of like why Bonapartism doesn't ever seem to go away as both a right and left response to populism. It seems to be what it almost always turns into. Mm-hmm. And why this was kind of a natural path of least resistance for leftists. Beyond like, oh, they're just PMC, because a whole lot of the book actually gets devoted to like us trying to figure out what that strata of society really is, what's the best way to label it, and that was related to what our project, which was a podcast project on intellectuals. We also just started noticing that, like, even though Anton Yeager and Anthony Borriello basically just declared left populism dead, it took 6 months for it to come back after the election of Zoran Mamdani. And I would say it's back into being the kind of default mode. We were even seeing people going and trying to launch defenses of how Mouffe and Laclau are relevant again. And
oh, man.
And all this. So
it sort of begs the question, right, is as to whether democratic socialist politics that is so institutionally and organizationally reliant on bourgeois parties, in the case of the United States, the Democratic Party, cannot escape. Perhaps our hypothesis would be that like this populist horizon is sort of the limit point at which you are constrained by the forces that ultimately determine your action, in this case, the Democratic Party.
Right.
And so it's that problem, that symptomatic kind of nexus point, which of course we didn't mention, results in the kind of what we might call a kind of bad Manichaeanism, a kind of bad two-class theory that seems to end up leading liberals to somehow accuse Marxists of being class reductionists when in reality they're being more like populists than Marxists in terms of how they're thinking about class. So that was another aspect to it. So, but there's a certain air of inevitability that populism is like this system of a symptom of repetition that we want to kind of halt or call into question.
Well, in the absence of any sort of mass politics in the United States, it's the thing that's there, right? And really, with like the populism of left Democrats that are run as democratic socialists, I guess, this really is like the third instantiation of some sort of populist surge, right? There would be the tragedy, which would be like the populist movement that was allied with Debs, and taking on the robber barons of their early 20th century. And then the second round of it would have been like Syriza, Podemos, Venceremos, those types of things. And this third one is just Democrats that are like sometimes willing to stand up to the DNC. It really is like a kind of a terrible, terrible populism. Not even the good populism.
Yeah, I think that there's a case. I mean, I certainly would make a case that the old populists, the People's Party and that independent movement plays a really different role, I think, than populism as an affectation on the part of the official, the parties of the establishment. So I was kind of wondering maybe if you could just talk about that more, like just kind of flesh that out, the contemporary populist elements compared to the populism with the capital P of the last century or 2 centuries ago.
Yeah, we're getting old.
Yeah, as a country. I would say I want to talk about this in terms of a couple of things, and then I'll turn it over to Daniel. But the one thing I would say is that you have an anti-political element to most populism, which actually tends to favor the right, if I'm completely honest. But it comes from a commodification and derationalization of civil society as such. So institutions that we used to rely on as part of a commons or collective are forms of collective human life that were not completely commodified. Church, parks, civic groups, Shriners, unions. But I'm specifically not just talking about unions, because I'm talking about other forms of civic life. They've been so thoroughly commodified that they're not available to most people, and this really begins probably around the 1970s. The reasons for that are complicated. One of which is going to be probably a second book that Daniel and I have been floating about, which is about social reproduction problems implied by this. But beyond that, I would also say there were community concentrations that were both diffuse but aligned around basically what we might call factory towns today. That made a lot of this civic organization a lot easier and a lot easier to maintain without commodification, even in capital. And the other thing is the so-called deindustrialization. And I say so-called deindustrialization because deindustrialization has 3 senses. The percentage of GDP produced by industrial production, which is still relatively high, although not as high as it was in the past. The amount of profits made from industrial production, that until Trump, too, was actually still pretty high. And then the amount of people employed in industrial production, and that's been falling through the floor since the 1970s. First from outsourcing and then through automation. This was noticed actually by the populists first. Gortz and his Goodbye to the Working Class was one of the first people to really write about it. And instead of trying to deal with what it meant for the class now, there was an explicit abandonment of class for sort of like left moral engagement on a class collaborationist basis. And Gortz is writing in the late 70s and 80s, but you really see this picked up by Hart and Negri in the 1990s and Mouffe and Lacroix in the late 80s and 90s themselves, or some of it going back to the 70s. So to get kind of technical for a second, what that means is because of the organic composition of capital, and that's a metaphor from agricultural production that Marx applies to industrial production, that the amount of fixed capital just decreases the amount of workers you need in any given area. And even if you did go back to industrial production, you would not have the concentrations of workers you had in the past, which means that anti-politics is easier to negotiate for a lot of people, which is an oppositional politics to the state than other forms of politics. And this tends to take a populist variance because populist morality has a broad mass appeal. It is very easy to construct the synthetic subject by saying it's the 99% versus the 1%. Now, we talk about Christopher Lash in this. Lash was actually one of the first people I saw critique this. He critiqued this against Michael Harrington in 1968 and 1972. When Harrington was trying to form what was then going to be a kind of populist response to the Democratic primary and what was going on in the American socialist and communist movement. This is kind of simultaneous to the beginnings of New Communism and the anti-imperial turn in the 70s. And Lash critiqued this for having a Manichaean and simple view of class that could even be given to paranoia, conspiracy theories, shit like we say today, like the Epstein class, that really led you to misunderstand internal class tensions and also not really have a program for dealing with working class needs. Now, unfortunately, as we write in our book, Lash betrays this. He actually becomes a populist. I personally, and Daniel can talk about it a little bit, out of despair. But what this means for us is that there is a political economic reason why populism is returning as a path of least resistance the way it was in the 19th century. Because the high concentrations of clearly industrial working class that are socialized by industrial production don't exist in the same way now in most of the world, except for China, probably. I mean, but even when you talk about like the developing world, like if you're a third worldist, the issue that you have there is formal production doesn't dominate the sectors of the working class there either. You don't have large sectors of formal employment with formal union membership, etc. You do have tons of proletarians, but they're not easily organizable. And in America, particularly after neoliberalism comes in, you have franchise models, things that make it impossible to do these contract negotiations and whatever else. And this political economic basis means that populism is a very easy way to try to construct a broad mass subject without constructing a broad mass subject. It is an imaginary of a broad mass subject, and one that tries to rely on a Manichaean ideology to push people into clear political activation. But as Stuart Hall actually kind of points out, the contradictions between these stratas and classes within this broad mass that you're trying to construct leads to more and more authoritarian politics, because what people need and want as these interests get more fine-tuned and once you actually get proximity to power are in direct contradiction to each other. And what the populists have promised is not possible to meet because of the tensions between these classes within its base. So, like we talk about this a little bit today, like we can think about this, like this turn against billionaires, which, fuck billionaires. I'm with you, right? But the idea that like that's the primary problem. If we just had a capitalism that had a cap on billionaires, things would be fine. The problem is the logic of capital leads to accumulation no matter what you do. And even if you had a wealth tax, that's not going to stop entirely. It might get ameliorated somewhat. It might be slightly better, but it's not going to stop just by like having an arbitrary number cutoff to the nominal income of some kind of capitalist. And I think this creates, and this is where I'm going to turn it to Daniel, kind of a psychic and ideological problem as well as a material problem. And populism, to me, is an easy answer out of that without really dealing with the fundamental questions. I hand it to Daniel.
Yeah, sure. So Excellent. The William Jennings Bryan Populist Party kind of merged with progressive liberal bourgeois parties. I think we could say overall, precisely because populism does not possess an anti-capitalist outlook of thinking political change, it becomes of sort of ventriloquist of what progressive liberalism won't say. So you could think about populism almost as like a moral element of progressive liberalism off to the side, kind of running a kind of sideshow that ultimately is quite copacetic to the establishment. The Debsian Socialist Party, of course, was not. And that I think is very distinct. And we get into that throughout the book, the difference between the Populist Party and the Socialist Party. And those are lessons, I think, for us in today's time, where we want to think a form of socialist politics that would truly get out of the deadlock of the two bourgeois parties, right? So we'd love to see what you guys think about that. I think the other thing I would point out is that class politics through a populist lens also leads to a kind of interminable resentment politics, because the elites are construed in a very inchoate way, right? It ultimately becomes very mercurial and unclear. And well, really what it becomes is sort of like a moralistic determination on an imminent division between some good elites that we will partner with and some bad elites.
Right.
But that's a very opportunistic conception. And then on the popular working class side, the same obfuscation is at work, because there's a celebration of the common man and the common man's wisdom that is not defined in any materialist way. Right now, historically, that was defined largely through an agrarian class space, or it was defined through petty shopkeepers and petty bourgeois subjects. And of course, you know, Derick and I are students of working class history, and some of the stuff that's come out, what you might call revisionist history of the working class movement of the 19th century, has revealed some interesting findings. I'm thinking here of the work of Jacques Rancière, the French philosopher historian, where he shows that really, Marxists put the petty bourgeois class position really at loggerheads to the proletarian movement for most of its existence, right? We always think of the petty bourgeois as some kind of a dangerous class, almost as dangerous as the lumpen proletariat, if you will. But what Rancière shows is that, in fact, petty bourgeois revolutionaries have a long-standing militancy stretching back to the conspiracy of equals with Babeuf and French Revolution all the way up to the present. So how do you, that's like a question of our book, which is that the petty bourgeois is not only the small business class, but it also is the new class. It is the PMC. And we get into this debate about revisiting Barbara and John Ehrenreich's argument for the PMC, which was as you guys know from reading the book, was a response to Nikos Palantzis, who had a completely different model, which we can talk about. Final thing I'll say, though, is that, one of our mentors, but also a figure who's very complex for both Derick and I, is Christopher Lash. And Lash kind of abandoned socialism tragically in his later career, right? Where, as Derick mentioned a moment ago, Lash has a very robust critique of early 20th century, late 19th century American populism. The basis of his critique was that they had no fidelity in the revolutionary power of the industrial proletariat. And Lash said socialism did, of course, and that's what made socialism far more coherent. Okay. And Lash is saying, well, now Marxists after the Second World War have basically said there is no more proletariat. The consensus seems to be, and it's not just Marcuse, right? It's like the consensus is now, well, that base that made Marxism work is gone. And the early Lash is a figure who's trying to argue that, in fact, it's not gone, that we can locate and maintain fidelity to a revolutionary working class agency. But then he abandons it. So we get into sort of that betrayal of Lash, if you will, right? When he adopts a populist outlook. And we do see that as a tragic kind of betrayal of his own, because, I don't know how much you guys know, but he wrote his dissertation on American liberalism and the Bolshevik Revolution, where he's extremely sympathetic to the Bolsheviks.
I haven't read it, but I've heard Varn talk about it enough, I think.
I feel like I should read it because I have.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of it of Lash, but I haven't read something which I get the impression is quite important, like in the way that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I think that the you guys talking about Eugene Debsian socialism as being sort of a path out of this deadlock is interesting. I have when you're reading non-Marxist discussions of Debs, they refer to him as like a populist socialist, or like a socialist who fused populism with socialism. And I guess basically that just means that he spoke to American concerns rather than talking like Lenin. You know, I don't know, but like
I would really push back against that myself, but I'd be curious to read whoever makes that argument. I think it's kind of off myself, but
no, I mean,
I would
obviously
think that part of it would be that if you have a socialist like Daniel de Leon, who was like the industrial proletariat, the unions are supposed to be revolutionary combat organizations. That's what we're talking about. Whereas Debs was it was worker centered, of course, but like try to utilize more of a. I would have, at least before this discussion, I would have just called it a populist appeal. In fact, that's actually one of the questions that I have for both of you is because I feel like the term populist is, vague and it's used a couple times, and I feel like maybe it's worth kind of getting into it a little bit more because you could be a populist like Eugene Debs was before he joined the Socialist Party, or you could be a populist like Viktor Chernov, who was an anti-capitalist. And he was, in the Russian sense, the Russian populist was very anti-capitalist, but very clearly not an industrially focused.
right.
It's not compatible. It's compatible with it's not Marxism. You can be a populist like who was FDR's vice president before
Henry Wallace.
Yeah, Henry Wallace. Or like in modern contemporary terms, you could say somebody like what Cenk Uygur wants to be a democratic populist, whatever, which is like barely meaningful at all, but it is a distinction. Or you could be a populist like the way that Donald Trump talks about how, or 10 years ago, he talked about how common people were being left behind and that was enough. So from my quick kind of cursory glance through this historical sketch, there's at least 4 different versions of what the word could mean.
So what do all those versions share, though? They share class collaborationism as a base and a focus on a key political figure. I would say with Debs, one of the things you have to deal with is even though he does have initial populist origins, despite his dalliances with the Knights of Labor and whatnot. By the time you get to Debs and the Socialist Party, he's actually combining SPD programmatism with syndicalist control of firms. Yeah. Effectively, and one of the only other times this happened after the First International, combining parts of an anarchist program with a relatively rigorous Marxist one. That really is not picked up again until William Z. Foster tries to do it in the American Communist Party and the CPUSA, with post 27 Bolshevization lines. So he's following the Comintern mandates of Bolshevization, but is still kind of maintaining this kind of partially programmatic, partially syndicalist view of workers' power. And what that gives you is a view of workers' power as something active and created and something that workers do, not something that is done for them. Okay. And that is something that all the other things that you mentioned from FDR and Henry Wallace forward, and even today, I mean, if you read Jacobin magazine, it's not like, yes, they want co-ops, which would kind of empower workers somewhat. Yes, they want reforms to help the working class, but most of what they want is still not even, I would say even half it's not even truly reformist. It's just policy changes that would favor elements of the working class on certain issues, so like education or healthcare. Right. And it's a rather piecemeal project. populism historically, going all the way back to the 17th century, is a piecemeal project. It is highly emotive, as a way to get past like cold rational interest, because those interests are often contradictory. Peasants and the working class only have overlapping interest in very specific time periods, like the development of imperial power or something like that. Now, when we talk about populists in the 20th century, we're not even talking about like peasants and the working class going together, or sharecroppers and the working class going together. You are talking about a flattening of the actual petit bourgeois, the professional managerial / cultural elite strata of the proletariat, who are effectively trained as petit bourgeois. We use Poulantzas's new petit bourgeois for them, although we modify that a little bit with more contemporary sociology because some conditions have changed since Poulantzas was broke. You have the service sector proletariat. You have an increasingly semi-lumpen blue-collar proletariat. And I say semi-lumpen, and we actually deliberately, change lumpen from a static category to a verb, because we see it through so much of society as a response to this removal of social space. But we don't think that, the lumpenized have markedly different needs than, quote, the lumpen did in the 19th century, which is they do need someone to support parts of the class structure that we might say are decaying under the weight of current development, and undoing things like their drug problems and their fact that they don't have mates and this, that, and the other. It's actually a deeply profound, both economic but social reproduction problem. And unlike in the past, one of the contentions we make is because of the way deindustrialization has been done, particularly in the Atlantic West, in the United States and in the Anglosphere, to a lesser degree probably in Australia. We didn't really go into that, but we have seen traits associated with the lumpen: minor criminality, informality of work, substance abuse, grifting, be more predominant in the blue collar working class, and populism tries to speak to that too. But I mean, I think whether it's right or left, you're going to have a problem that you're going to need an authoritarian figure to clamp down on the oppositional interest of these different groups. Whereas there are oppositional interests within the working class, and Daniel and I admit that. We do not try to pretend that there's a nice, clean, united working class that we could just pick up and valorize today. In fact, that's part of the problem. But working class interests, even when you're dealing with the semi-lumpenized, are fairly clear, because most people who have drug problems or don't have partners or whatever, they don't like that shit. Like they just don't. And it's weird actually, because one of the things that you and I have talked about this too, Chris and Jason, this tendency of left populists to first critique a thing, but then say the thing is good. So, for example, I've talked about this in terms of weight. We talked about like the tendency of the poor to be given diets that cause them to carry excess weight, and how that shouldn't lead to shaming. Becomes like, well, it's not a problem that people are fat. All right. Or like family abolition starts to be used as an excuse for, it's not a problem that 1/8 of blue collar men don't have any partners or any children in their life at all. Or stuff like that. And I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Hello, everyone. It's Chris, just dropping in to remind you that we have a Patreon. For a few of your hard-earned dollars, you can get access to one of our 3 tiers. The first tier is just ad-free access to our public episodes. The second tier gives you access to all of our Patreon exclusive episodes, which includes 2 bonus episodes a month and 2 geopolitics episodes a month. And the third tier is just the same as the one before that, but more expensive. Now, all 3 of these tiers give you access to our Discord, which is a zone for social interaction, as well as a place to discuss politics, theory, the news, and to plan our book clubs. Also, we have merch available. We have a couple of different t-shirt designs, and you can pick from different colors, whether you want short sleeve or long sleeve. And it's a way to support the show and get some pretty cool looking stuff. One final thing. Make sure to like and subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite podcatching app to help drive the algorithm to suggest us to more people. Enjoy the rest of the show.
I think one way to think about this, based on the beautiful and really very interesting question that you pose, because we honor, I think, the gravity of the phenomenon, although we're focusing on left populism in the text, right? Well, one way to think about it would be to remember that the new left did institutionally, to the Gramscian march through the institutions and all of that. The face of radicalism and militancy also changed in the 60s and 70s in very significant ways, which we still, of course, live with. And social movements have become like a very real part of the fabric of left-wing activism and politics. And there's no way around that. And I think that we take social movements quite seriously, but one of the things we try to do at the end of the book when we talk about strategy is argue that a Marxist understanding of civil society, right, as the sort of ground of these various social movements that become the sort of fecund environment where left populists get their energy from, right? Well, if you take a thinker like Ernesto Laclau, part of the argument there is that working class atomization and passivity requires militants to find new coalitional allies to build a left populist hegemonic bloc, right? And he develops a very elaborate theoretical system to construct the people, as it were. And incidentally, Laclau, despite his leftism, is very much committed to a kind of quasi-Bonapartist left-wing titular master leader figure, right? For him, it's Perón. Peronism is the central glue. But he's always quite clear that every left populist bloc needs its own kind of figure. It's a question as to how Marxism is to respond to that. So in a way, I think the text that Derick and I wrote is a grappling with the fact that some of the most preeminent Marxist theorists, and I think Laclau and Mouffe, his partner, Laclau passed away, of course, their 1985 text, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, we see as probably the strategic document written by, on behalf of socialism after the collapse of the USSR. And we argue that what if we read the Laclauian project as already having had its moment of success, as it were, and therefore as saturated, not as something that's totally dead to us, that doesn't teach us anything. No, it's full of lessons. But in fact, we would argue that it has been largely adopted by the left. And in a way, it reached its crescendo and perhaps its ending point with the Syriza and the Podemos moment, right? That then, with Corbyn and Sanders, was kind of institutionalized into the bourgeois party apparatus, and again faced all of these barriers. But we take seriously like that left populist moment, but we also recognize that we are at a serious impasse with the whole repertoire of what it represents and what it stands for.
Okay, yeah. So that's actually very that's compelling. And for anybody who's listening who has never read the book, that is maybe even the primary argument for reading the book, at least as far as I can tell. But I guess I kind of want to go back a little bit, because on the just in terms of what anybody who's never read this or has not yet read it, I kind of feel like maybe we would want to go into a little bit about the connection between the neoliberal moment and the left populism moment, because I think that's going to sound a little bit backward. In fact, it kind of did to me at first. When I was reading it, I was kind of thinking, this seems counterintuitive. But I've read this book and I've talked with you a bunch, so I kind of know. But maybe that would actually help a lot with the background.
You want to start, Daniel?
Yeah, this is helpful. So we frame this through this argument that social antagonisms and contradictions of the neoliberal social order tend to appear as what we know as the cultural, you could call it kind of like the culturalization of politics, or as moral crises. And this sort of presentation of politics is what produces the populist kind of outrage, right? So the system is primed to have these sort of conflagrations of what Stuart Hall calls moral panics.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we try to show in the book is that part of what theory does, or what like a study of the ideological conjuncture of one's time can contribute to, is a sort of greater literacy and clarity of what constitutes politics. Like, it almost becomes a question of like political epistemology in a certain way, because I think that populism feeds off of these moral panics. And Stuart Hall in Policing the Crisis, that if you guys have read it, does a whole genealogy of moral panic stretching back decades and decades in British society. And it's quite interesting. You could sort of summarize it as a kind of bourgeois nominalist form of politics, where they're sort of taking sort of culture war polemics to distract the plebs or to distract the people, and that the populist leader, and here it becomes a bit interesting, because the populist leader almost becomes an inevitable model of every leader, irrespective of them being like Trump or Bernie Sanders, as fully outside of the two bourgeois parties. They become a master of playing with moral panics, playing with the culture war, if you will. So that's an element that I think is very essential, which is that populism has this kind of sense of inevitability, because class struggle politics seems to have been pushed to the margins in the field of general bourgeois politics. So that's a major element at play here. And we feel that, in a sense, I feel that only an independent socialist party beginning, and this is something we argue at the end of the book, beginning with a tacit construction of a civil society. I think like this idea of working within the state apparatus, or working within the PMC, or working within even the bureaucracy, would be sort of like a misreading of Marx's conception of a proper Marxist strategy.
Yeah, sure.
It could only happen initially in civil society, where we could begin to create institutions that might begin to think about what politics could look like in a different valence than this kind of constant. And like, I mean, I guess part of this is, of course, digital media. Part of this is television. Part of this is the internet. Part of this is the sort of speed by which these moral panics now circulate and obfuscate things. But like, I'll give you just a concrete example that you may remember from the book. It's like, so much of working class life is muted in this parade of moral panics, that we lose a grasp on the kind of true root of social antagonisms that weigh us down as political actors. And we argue this creates a kind of profound dejected passivity amongst the working class to even participate in bourgeois politics. So in that sense, as Derick said, populism becomes an anti-politics. And it becomes a kind of mouthpiece for the liberal progressive party. Maybe they're saying things a little bit more militant sounding than the progressives, but policy-wise, they are the same as the progressives. Or on the right, they're saying things a little bit more angry and resentful than the Republican Party, but policy-wise, they are the Republican Party, just like Trump in a way, right? So I guess, I don't know, Derick, if you would say like the Bonapartist figure as a figure of political leadership as Marx has given us and subsequent Marxists have given us, in a way becomes very close to the populist leader in form. And I would actually be curious how Derick would articulate that, but I would say those are a few of the dimensions there.
Yeah, I would say that populism has an inherent Bonapartist problem for the same reasons that Bonapartism existed in the first place. Particularly if you think about Marx's critique of giving people the general franchise before they had the institutions or developed economy for dealing with it. So Marx is obviously pro-democratic, but he was worried that like reactionary powers could use the general franchise because of the social chaos of decaying elements of the class to offer an authoritarian answer to the problem. And the reason why it has to be authoritarian in Bonaparte is like, how do you satisfy the lumpen and a bunch of reactionaries who are former aristocrats who don't really have a place in modern production and the state apparatus and nullify the party of order? And that is through straight up violence, actually, and thuggery. And I think the populist leader has the same problem, and I'll tell you that because we can look at Trump to see examples of this on the right very, very easily. The petite bourgeois needs of a low tax base and relatively free competition against regulating rentiers that are now part of Trump's coalition, like the tech oligarchs who need a very regulated market and a very strong central state, despite trying to like suck out elements of the welfare state apparatus. You will notice none of them have been trying to weaken the military at all, because they need that strong central state to operate. They know they do. And it's not just against like, oh, namby-pamby weirdo leftists like us. It's also against other elements of the petite bourgeoisie. Trump's own base is a threat to Trump. Now, that's going to be true for Corbyn. If Corbyn ever really had power, that would be true for Bernie Sanders. It's true for Zohran Mamdani in New York. And controlling that base becomes how you show political competence as a populist leader. So one of the things that, I have a lot of anti-political activists on my show. Sometimes I'm friends with Joseph Sorrentino and Grant over at the Rabble Report, and I've had Tateza on a prior show, and I've talked a lot about this. They seem to view the populist negative politics as like a good thing, and it's about the decay of mass bases and all this. The same thing that Anton Yeager talks about in his book Hyperpolitics, which I often agree with. But what you notice if you take Anton Yeager's Hyperpolitics seriously and you like read it in correlation with our book, what is being done there is a kind of managerial control of conflicting interests through getting people to focus on culture war issues that do not endanger whatever allegiances within the capitalist class, which is highly contradictory right now itself. This is another thing that we don't talk so much about, but the intense competition between sectors of capitalism and between what they need is also driving this, because you don't have high profitability in traditional industrial commodity production. I know that you'll hear leftists say, oh, there's so much profits right now. But what they're looking at is rent revenues and IP revenues and other forms of state-captured, enforced profit mechanisms. Because if commodity production was profitable as it was in the past, there's no damn way capitalists would want the kind of state apparatus that they're getting now. The reason why they want it is that they need to compel people into relationships that you can't get from just commodity exploitation anymore. So what you are seeing is a highly advanced form of capitalism that the other traditional ways of dealing with the profitability crisis aren't really readily available for anyone anymore. You have an economy also that has removed production and thus variable labor. Offshore, can't move it offshore anymore, but also is trying to automate it. But the problem with automating is it drops production profits eventually down to cost, as anyone has read Marx. But there's empirical evidence for this too. It's not just an argument from Marx. Look at the way look at the prices on tech and how fast it drops, to see how this works. Tech inputs don't have a lot of industrial inputs into them. They have a lot of industrial, but they don't have a lot of labor inputs into them anymore. Their prices drop really quickly as soon as the IP holds go, and they're not profitable. So there is a way in which we are talking about this in terms of just good old fashioned fucking political economy in an advanced stage where we're at. So what this also means, and this is where some of my stuff comes in, the complexity of this organization to maintain this means that you have to spend a lot of energy on expertise forms of variable capital, managers, developers, service. The problem with that is it's always going to be inflationary. Service inflation is something that's been studied. For example, if you look at American price rates, service inflation has never gone away. Neither has land inflation, right? Whereas we've had periods of commodity production where inflation was not really a problem, and that balances it out. Right now, there's nothing balancing out anymore, which means that these populist measures are going to have to be more and more authoritarian to build any kind of power base. And that manifests as anti-politics, but it quickly becomes into a politics that's basically at war with general society. And I think you see this not just in Trump, but in even liberal figures like Macron, who's increasingly a Bonapartist figure. You see this in the way a lot of left populists lose their popularity very quickly because they cannot deal out to all the things that they possibly deal out. They don't have currency sovereignty at a local level or something like that. So you increasingly see this focus on moral appeals. And the other thing that comes up from Anton Jaeger that we kind of developed parallel is this hyperpolitics function. And we don't use that term in the book, but it's related to this thing that Stuart Hall said, is that if you use these culture war issues to manage society, you have people who think they're engaging in politics who aren't really engaging in politics because they're not touching political economy at all. And they're not even really affecting the decisions around these cultural issues. They're just very activated about it. And it's a politics of resentment. It's a politics of pseudo engagement, but there's not really much you can do, because if these cultural issues truly do start to hit the bottom line of production, they'll die immediately. And I've talked about this for 10 years. I talk about, multiculturalism exists on the left, so sure, who cares? Except when it doesn't, because we still have to deal with the fact that any cultural form that's actually a threat to bourgeois development will not be tolerated, even in a place like the UK or Canada. Not even in the United States. And this is also true for right-wing concerns. If right-wingers start getting too obviously anti-capitalist or obviously against certain interests, like the right-wing anger at the Epstein files, that's going to have to be suppressed. And that creates an internal problem that you have to have the state come in and intervene to fix, and you need a strong figure to do that. That, to me, is a trans-ideological problem with populism because of its class collaborationist nature. It cannot deliver any clear goods to a clear sectional mass base that has similar interests to each other. And for us as socialists, this presents a problem because we can't really either at the current moment, which is why I think all that stuff from the 60s about like the working class being reactionary, we need to find another subject, was bad. It was dumb, but it didn't come from nothing. And it wasn't just like, oh, racism or sexism. Both were real. And Daniel and I acknowledge that. We talk a lot about this. We're not denying the realities of those things. But that there was also, even as early as 1962, 1963, a problem with this Fordist mass production model, profitability and its availability to deal with competition. And that was a problem for the working class, and also the working class's own development and factory production at the time. They didn't want their kids to go into it. They had dreamed of a better life for their kids and some kind of service sector and managerial work as part of the promise of what they had built this Fordist infrastructure for. And so there was all kinds of contradictions leading to this. Some of this we go into the book, some of this we don't. But it's one of these things that we really have talked about. It's one of the reasons why Daniel and I have really actually started thinking about social reproduction, after this period of populism, because a lot of the appeal here and the reason why these moral panics work so well is they do get into real social social reproduction issues that are caused by developments in political economy. Like after the 2007, after the Great Recession, the amount of like service sector construction work and whatnot went away. So all this kind of commodity production and real estate started being reduced in need. And even economically, even when houses came back on the market, there was an incentive to keep the stock low at the time, to keep housing prices up. So what you had is a derationalization, like a real lumpenizing of whole sectors of like the construction industry. And that leads to very reactionary politics. But even if it had a left valence, even if it came up through Corbyn or Sanders, they'd have to control it somehow. And they'd have to do so outside of mass-based interests because they'd have to cut into their bases to do that. And so these social issues become the bread and butter of politics. And one of the things that we noticed, and I'll turn it back to Daniel, is that even the anti-populist, like the liberal technocrats of the post-war consensus going into the 70s, start using populist rhetoric. You see this with the Atari Democrats in the 1980s that lead to Clintonism in the 1990s. They start using populist rhetoric to make anti-populist points because this is now seen as the only way to get any kind of legitimacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think once Sanders and Trump opened the door, we're now witnessing, especially at this moment with the Iran war and the disintegration of the sort of Trump with the kind of fragmentation of MAGA, let's say, as a kind of coherent social movement and political movement. I think the bourgeoisie is eager to franchise and kind of commodify populism as a kind of faux or sort of fake artificial form of political agitation, right? As a kind of controlled opposition, right? And we can go into details about what that specifically looks like at this very particular moment if you guys are interested, but I think it goes to your point and your question about the kind of heterogeneity of populism, right? It's not only left and right, it seems to be something far more ubiquitous to that. And I think, the title of our book is almost a provocation. After left populism, the word after, why after, right? Would be a provocation insofar as like, well, can we acknowledge that we've hit a limit? Can we acknowledge that something has saturated, right? Because we can go on and continue to not acknowledge it. But I think that's the kind of dialogue the book wants to have, like we're pointing to something. And I don't know if you guys tend to agree with us on that. I'd be very curious, but that's sort of where we're coming from,
So interestingly, I think I might, but in the spirit of dialogue, I kind of feel like I want to just maybe
Sure.
I want to raise a question, or I guess because it seems like the issue is not so much one of populism as an orientation of like the socialist / workers movement, but rather of like left populism as a replacement for like class independence when it comes to the like the Podemos and the De Linkes and even the Franz Sonsomis, the parties. Because I think if you think about like socialists, historically socialists with like let's say a populist appeal as part of the strategies, like the Bolsheviks, I think are like that's my favorite example. But even like I know that we might all agree on this, but the Popular Front era communist parties, because like that's, as far as I can tell, that's the strategy which has compelled communists to victory. Now, whether they should have been, whether or not that worked out well, that's another question. But okay, so like in Lenin sort of talked about the using this concept of the vanguard, like, okay, if the organized self-organized, self-motivated proletariat is the vanguard of the proletariat, and that's who the communists are supposed to organize. You also could think of the proletariat as like the vanguard of the people, right? Like the communists, yeah, we're supposed to organize the industrial proletariat, but then they're supposed to lead all the office workers. They kind of march behind the industrial workers, and all the peasantry is hopefully supposed to march behind the working class as a whole, and even the I don't know, the layers of the classes which might be hostile to us, but are like oppressed because of their religion or because of their race. If we can imagine, like in this moment where the proletariat is being led by the Communist Party, they can lead the people, so to speak. So I guess that, yeah, just I want to reiterate the question, which is like it's not so much a question, but it seems, I guess it's more of a statement. To me, it seems like this is a question of the decision, even consciously, to adopt left populism as a new way of being, as opposed to part of the strategy for a workers' socialist party.
So yeah, I was just mentioning this kind of question about co-optation and left populism and the way of the challenge of the people, this sort of seemingly kind of noble category, which, as was rightly pointed out, Marxists and socialists have not necessarily shied from. Although the question about, Stalinism was very eager to be very opportunistic about how they used the people. By the way, I'm sure you guys are familiar with that, and that actually veered into extremely problematic territory, in my opinion. But like you mentioned, even with a kind of high watermark example of the Bolsheviks, there still is, in some cases, appeals to the people, but always calibrated with a very careful class strategic emphasis in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's the dictatorship of the working class and the peasantry, for example. It's not the dictatorship of the people.
Right.
So there is a sense that Marxists have that the Jacobin appeal to the people is itself unrefined and naive on the one hand. On the other hand, it does not take seriously the reality of class struggle that needs to be addressed as a priority of politics in capitalist society. And it's difficult for us today because so much of liberal ideology puts Marxism into a box of so-called class reductionism when we start to talk about or come up with rationales or justifications or reasoning why we need class-centered politics. I mean, famously, Ernesto Laclau did his dissertation where he argued that Marxism is a class reductionist ideology, but he, of course, says, well, I'm now a post-Marxist and we can still maintain fidelity to Marx and so on. So the question becomes one of facing that liberal challenge to Marxism, right? And I've written on this, and even before my work with Varn on this, and that's something we get into at the end of the text, right? Which is, what does it mean for American socialism in particular to take on the hegemony of liberalism, right? Which we see as something that left populism actually doesn't adequately do.
Yeah, I'd say I agree with that.
Right. Yeah. So those are some thoughts there. I mean, I think, Derick, I'd be very curious to see what you think about the problem of constructing the people, right? Again, it's one of those things which has the veneer or the sort of appearance of a righteous gesture, but which can be quite perfunctory if done when you are beholden to liberal institutions, would be one way to get at what I'm trying to say. And I think we've seen that. So it becomes kind of shallow in the same way that Joe Biden appealing to the people becomes extremely shallow, right?
Well, just real quick, I think we have to give flowers to probably the most successful left populist revolution in history, and that would be the Chinese Communist Party's rise to power. Right? That's a class collaborationist movement. I'm that is mostly a joke. I think Varn and I have referred to it on the podcasts together as the most successful of the bourgeois revolutions. But yeah, I mean, the nature of the Chinese Communist revolution ended up being one of a developmentalism, in which like the utilization of class collaboration was like absolutely integral for them becoming what they are today.
That's true, but they also had a class. That's true. But they also had a class politics which abolished a particular class, namely the peasantry.
Yes,
so
that's true. Yeah,
that you see, that's the thing that goes back to what we were talking about before of the populist party in the U.S. The political economy outlook of the theoreticians of populism are not anti-capitalist. They're not Marxist. So you don't get class abolition as a horizon of demand.
Right.
So this baked into the populist orientation is therefore a type of passivity at this Marxist level of politics.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into basically my defense of certain concepts, but not necessarily their popular use. So, like, if in a discussion like this, I would say the Popular Front as a strategy, I think it's a good one. But popular frontism as a ethic, as an ideology, I don't think is a good one. And again, I know that at least Varn and I maybe we all have different opinions, but at least Varn and I disagree.
Can you say just a little bit more about why you find the Popular Front, at least historically, to have been?
So there are no moments yet in history of an exclusively working class socialist party coming to power without a Popular Front strategy of some sort. Except for maybe the Bolsheviks, but even that's a little bit tricky because that's where I would say there's the collaboration with non-proletarian radical parties. But like the Chinese Revolution, everything that happens in Eastern Europe, all over the world, there's some degree of a conscious Popular Front as part of the strategy for taking power, and even in most cases, even part of the strategy for holding power. So like in Vietnam, in China, most everywhere.
Czechoslovakia is a really good one.
Oh yeah, especially the Popular Front is a conscious, overt part of the ruling apparatus. Now, again, I think we can discuss how good these things are, but I think that the Popular Front as an orientation, as a strategy, has, on its own terms, has been very successful.
As a way to civil war.
I would also contrast this with what has been called, even by proponents of it, the Popular Front in the United States, which is, I think, a very different thing.
Right, like the Popular Front as conceived of, what you're talking about here is communists working within a front where they are an integral part, and actually, in many cases, taking the lead in the front. Whereas in the United States, what we have always called popular frontism is working class organizations submitting themselves to coalitions that include the Democratic Party, which I would argue is against the entire purpose of forming the front in the first place.
So there's a lot to break down here, and you guys can hear my hostility actually come out, and it's going to be profound.
Okay.
One, Popular Front as a strategy does not emerge until 1936. Before 1936, it is not a strategy. We need to be very specific about what the Popular Front is. It is not just class collaborationism. It is explicitly willing to sit in power to oppose reactionary parties with liberal parties in a coalition government or coalition resistance to further communist interests by furthering liberal interests simultaneously. That is what it is. Its prior formation is in the French pre-socialist movement. That's where it comes from. That's why it emerges in France in 1936 first. Is just stalled because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact really fuck up any alliance that you could really do if the Soviet Union's in alliance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop, and at least a détente with the Nazis trying to form a popular front on the basis of fighting fascists makes no sense. So you have the Popular Front being formally adopted only after that starts to fall apart. In China, you do have a united front led by the KMT, who's representing China in the Comintern, not the Chinese Communist Party, because Stalin didn't think they were developed enough. And that leads to a civil war. In the West,
500,000 communists being killed by the KMT.
Right.
Yeah.
In the West, the Popular Fronts all subsume themselves to liberal. The reason why post-Marxism happens is because of what the French and Italian, in specific, communist parties had to do to maintain any sort of Popular Front with the Gaullists after the end of the war. And this gets exacerbated when you have a socialist party come to power with Mitterrand in the 80s in France. Go back and read Baudrillard. It's incredibly clear what happens there. Now, you can argue you have something like a Popular Front with a coalition with the peasants. And this gets us into what the Mergerthicha is, what the mass line is, and a bunch of other things. I will actually sympathize, though, a little bit with Chris when he said that the Chinese Revolution ends up being a Popular Front, but only because of New Democracy, which happens in the 50s, not because of everything else. And the reason why I would say New Democracy, because New Democracy is a deliberate attempt to incorporate the petite bourgeoisie into the coalition on, quote, not unquote, non-comprador lines. And Mao says it's only supposed to last for a very brief period of time because they're basically needing to do the bourgeois development internally. And in fact, he declares it over by the mid-50s. However, it kind of gets maintained everywhere pretty much indefinitely, because it leads to the abolition of the self-abolition, really, of the peasantry. And this is something that endnotes in Theory of Separation, Endnotes Volume 4, which is a text that we don't mention a lot, but I have strong critiques of, but they're right about. That what we saw in these revolutions that call themselves socialist in the developing world and national liberationists in the developing world, which were actually more supported by the Soviet Union than they were by the PRC too, just historically speaking. The PRC,
yeah, definitely
in every case,
yeah. That they ended up almost universally stuck in a developmental trap, abolish the peasantry, and then didn't have to subordinate themselves to global capitalism. We could argue that the only ones of these actually existing socialist movements that still exist as states all did that willingly and in a controlled manner. That's what Dungism really ends up being in the 1980s. This is a control integration into the capitalist world on terms favorable to the long-term development of China that had internal contradictions that we often don't talk about when talking about China today. The extent of liberalization and the extent of the reversals, not just of the Cultural Revolution, but of the collective period altogether, are not really spoken about all that much in left-wing circles because they're kind of deeply problematic for people to deal with. And, I think there's an entire historiography right now around quote, Western Marxists, unquote, that exists solely to not deal with this problem, to not go into why the Sino-Soviet split happened and what happened because of the integration of China into the capitalist world. Vietnam, same thing. Cuba and the DPRK don't do the same thing, but that's not because of their own choices. That's because of being shut out of the legal framework of international capital. It's not because they didn't want to. They weren't allowed to. And we've seen developments in the DPRK, partly because China and Russia have been willing to kind of develop a parallel global capitalist framework for which the DPRK can interact and do some bourgeois developmentalism after the Soviet Union fell. Now, none of this comes up on our book, but I think it's really important when we talk about the success of, quote, popular fronts, unquote, to remember that the logic of a popular front is you are going to enter a civil war and you know it. That's, and in the Soviet case and in the Chinese case, that for sure happened. All right. That's what 1920 is, and that's what the civil wars in the late 40s, early 50s in China are. In the Western case, it doesn't happen. But what happens then? Well, all those communist parties basically self-liquidate, ideologically or literally. So I think we have a popular front-shaped hole. The issue is, popular frontism is not just class collaborationism. It is a very specific form of political organization. It's not even possible to do in the United States. Why? We're not a parliamentary democracy. We're a weird other form of democracy for which how we can't form there's no such thing as a coalition government in the U.S. That does not exist. There's no way that I can join with another party and sit in a coalitionary government in the United States. That's not structurally possible, which is part of why all the attempts to import popular front strategies are always going to end up being interest subordination to whatever party that you're trying to go with. And since the Populist Party, that has always been the Democratic Party. Now, in the 19th century, before the Populist Party, it was actually an open question. And if you were going to ask to Marx, what party should we critically support in a united front, he would have said the Republicans for obvious reasons. They were the more progressive bourgeois party, at least a faction of it was, some of which the radical Republicans even had mild socialist sympathies. We know this from Marxist letters to Lincoln, which Lincoln never responded to, but they existed. Now, I want to get into the rhetoric of the people a lot here because the Democrat...
You'll note that I did make your point before this conversation started.
Yeah.
I said that in order for a popular front to be a popular front, the communist element has to enter into it and lead, or at least be, of equal partnership with the other, that's not possible in the United States.
Right. It's not.
Yeah. It's not like in Czechoslovak socialism. That's
right.
That's it becomes a different discussion at a certain point. As it matters for this discussion, that's okay. Fair enough.
Right.
When almost all of the Eastern European socialist states that collapsed, obviously, right, were popular front governments that transformed into full socialist states, right?
Right.
Yeah. But yeah.
The issue that you have, though, is the ones that didn't subordinate themselves to the capital market have all collapsed, except for two.
Yeah.
And one of them looks to be collapsing right in front of our face because of international intervention, which, of course, we just should actually somewhat ask us, now that the Soviet Union gone, why has it taken so long for this kind of intervention to happen? But I just want to quote the Brumaire and then get back to my point, because I do think we are using popular front in two different ways. One is class collaboration with what we might call the laboring masses, who are not technically working class because they're not technically free labor dependent on the wage fund, right? I agree with you. There's been no revolution that's just the working class by itself, part of which is because the working class in the industrial area can't produce its own food. That's sort of a big damn deal. Today, it's a little bit more interesting because there is no peasantry pretty much anywhere outside of South America. I mean, I have an anarchist friend who's always trying to convince me that like the agrarian parts of like Europe and commercial farm in Europe is really constitutive of a modern peasantry to which we could form a coalition. And I would just look at him and be like, it's agribusiness. There's not subsistence farmers anywhere.
Yeah.
They don't exist anymore. So to bring this back, maybe.
I want to hear Jason's response to all of that, though. I think we have to, because you didn't get a chance. I want to hear what you say to this.
Oh, I mean, it starts to become incidental to the primary discussion, really. But
that's okay. But no, I'm just curious, please.
To me, it's a big part of emphasizing the right details, I think, because when we're talking about left populism as a distinct orientation, a new garb that you can take your Trotskyist Communist Party and rebrand it as an anti-capitalist party, and you can just, instead of organizing
about the NEP,
the NPA, yeah.
NPA, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Instead of organizing the factory workers to, ostensibly, supposedly one day seize control of production, you can instead canvass for votes, whatever. I think that's a distinct ideological trajectory that the entire global workers' movement has been on. I mean, if we could even say there is a workers' movement, and I would say that's just a very different thing than I would defend the populist lexicon or orientation for a workers' party which is actually organized in the working class, and then recognizing that that's a minority part of the population. And in the same way, I would defend the Popular Front from the vantage point of Prague, and not from the vantage point of Washington D.C. for a lot of the same reasons why you just mentioned, Derick. So I think that these things become a little bit. We simplify things so much that they become unnecessarily contentious. But also, I think that they should be talked out.
That's right.
But yeah, I mean, it's like I don't have like a firm, hard disagreement, but it's a mild one.
I think I do have a firm, hard disagreement, but I
know
do
this about you.
I do think that the idea that this does lead us to an impasse today, and I want to like play this out to how this relates to our original logic, and then I'm going to throw my quote from the Vermeerian because I think it's a different one than the one we quote in the book, but it's actually relevant here about the construction of the people. We are currently living in a very strange time political economically, in that the majority of jobs that currently exist are in the service sector, an area that was a bugbear for classical Marxism. If you read Clive Burrow's book, which we refer to in ours, trying to figure out if service sectors were proletarian or not was like the major question of the day, because they were so they were precarious seasonally. There were large times where they were out of work because they just weren't needed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They also have a contentious relationship to capital productivity. What do I mean by that? I mean two things. One, a lot of them are dependent on areas that are socially necessary but not productive to capital surplus. And put into simple, normal people terms, they don't generate that much profit. They just don't. All right. Services are high labor. They have high labor inputs. And so you have to pay the worker the cost of social reproduction pretty much 1-to-1. And part of the reason why this is hard to change is because, like, one barber can only cut one person's hair at a time. The productivity gains are possible, but they're not possible in the same way they are in industrial production. And regular old normie economists know this. I was listening to Patrick Boyle's like finance podcast, and he was talking about this problem with the service sector inflation, and why also it does not lead to a super rich service sector. Despite all the inflation that goes on with it. is because of the limits of productivity gains. And this can be mapped back into traditional notice of fixed and constant capital in productivity, in the way that like services just don't have the same relationship. The other thing is, though a lot of these services are socially necessary, particularly when you have more and more needs for, say, education or whatnot, that the capitalists themselves don't want to directly pay for. They rather share that cost with the entirety of society. So you have massive increases in like the public sector who are working in services, even in the neoliberal period. You see the growth of education, you see the growth of healthcare dramatically. Now let's get to the Brumaire quote, and then we can talk about like why this is an issue for us. And this is one here. This is from the 18th Brumaire. The Democrat, because he represents the petit bourgeois, that is the transitional class in which the interests of the two classes are simultaneously mutually blunted, imagines himself elevated above class antagonism generally. The Democrats concede, this is small d, that a privileged class confronts them, but they, along with the rest of the nation, form the people. And Marx goes in to just attack this concept. That's in the Brumaire. The reason why that's important, and why the stuff about what I have elsewhere, I didn't use the term in the book, but I've used it on podcasts, called the rational kernel of PMC critique, even though I don't believe the PMC is even a thing. I do and I don't. I don't think it's the right way to conceive of it. Is that
strata, not a class?
Yeah, it's a strata. And it's a strata of several different classes, really. Mm-hmm. But my point about it is that it has petit bourgeois habitus and origins, and this is why I agree with Daniel. Daniel and I were going back and forth about what to call this, like, because we both kind of reject the idea that the PMC isn't coherent on a liberal basis. There's not a coherent income strata to which it belongs. There's not a coherent if you say, oh, it's about credentialing and opportunity capture. Well, that's true for some blue collar jobs too. Like electricians are licensed. Like there's credentialing and opportunity capture there.
Yeah.
Then what is it that makes the PMC a class? And according to John and Barbara Ehrenreich, it was you had a college education and that entitled you to the ability for a chance to enter the management sections of society. So it was a kind of leftification of James Burnham ideology.
Boy, is that not true anymore.
Yeah. Well, John and Barbara Ehrenreich, I mean, John, when Barbara died, and Barbara, and I think the early aughts actually pointed out that it wasn't true anymore. There was already a schism in the PMC. And my point is like, well, that's because the class didn't ever make sense as a concept. But what you do see is a strata of professionals who historically were petit bourgeois because their means of production was their own expertise, and they employed themselves. And what you have seen in the developed world during the 20th century is they don't employ themselves anymore in the same way. So professors, like, they are now more or less employees. They're labor aristocratic employees, particularly if they're tenured. And this is one of the Daniel and I have gotten in trouble because we don't believe in tenure. But that it's this labor aristocratic privilege. I find it weird that a lot of supposed socialists really want to defend tenure. Another one
myself.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly. I would love to have tenure, but you know what I'd also love? Just to have decent labor protections instead of some weird aristocratic class that is dependent on an army of TAs and adjuncts to survive.
Well, it's kind of like how I would like $1 million, but I don't think there should be millionaires.
Yeah, same thing.
Well, I think there's another thing we try to do. There's another thing we try to introduce in this debate that I just want to throw on the table and maybe gather your thoughts on it, which is, so usually we've inherited this kind of way of thinking about ideology, which is kind of, I think, a little bit vague. It's like very psychoanalytic, maybe Althusserian, and we adopt a different way of thinking about ideology of the new petit bourgeois or the PMC, through a kind of model inspired by Goran Terborn, a Marxist sociologist, where he says the ideology of the petit bourgeois can be assessed when we're able to locate their proximity to the generation of surplus value, and therefore their maintenance of the status quo. And so what you get is a very interesting way of thinking about what is truly problematic about the PMC. If you're able to have that kind of materialist location of certain class agents that are basically responsible for repurposing, inventing, and reproducing what we might call the superstructure or culture under the kind of presuppositions of a maintenance of the status quo. Now, within that, there's a lot of new petit bourgeois or downwardly mobile petit bourgeois who are actually quite distant from that nexus of domination, right? And we feel that perhaps socialists should honor the fact that, well, there's something potentially, you see, because a lot of PMC theorists, from like Catherine Liu to Vivek Chibber, to sometimes even Adolf Reed, they have a sense of homogenizing the entirety of this class without any attention to that distinction that I just drew out. And we feel that unless we are able to draw out those kinds of distinctions, how could we ever propose something like a merger thesis? Or how could we ever really think something like a coherent relationship between professionals and workers, or educated professionals and workers, right? It leads to, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of PMC theory leads to a certain resentment politics at worst, or intra-PMC fighting at best, which is most common. And we feel that there has to be another way. And this is why you may find it interesting. We really found that this largely forgotten Marxist theorist of the new class, Alvin Goldner, gives us a slightly more optimistic appraisal of the problem here, which we're not necessarily championing that kind of naive optimism there, because he thinks that you can indeed locate a kind of emancipatory kernel of this class, but he thinks that Marxists have failed to activate that element. So we have the sense that perhaps there is a way to do that, and that leads us to the sections of the text on the merger thesis.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to talk about the PMC section of the text, and so we just went into it, so I could just cross that off my list of things to talk about. But yes, the merger thesis is also something else that I wanted that to be drawn out in discussion. But so please continue, Varn. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's great. I think the merger thesis is important because you have a fundamental problem. Now, this is a point in Kauskian analysis that I actually disagree with the neo-Kauskians who take the classical Kauskian line that the working class in and of itself will eventually come to socialism, even if socialists didn't exist and there was no socialist program. Which this is why I want to say this is the part of Jason's argument that I'm actually somewhat sympathetic towards. The intellectuals, wherever they come from, intellectual in Russia was a specific set of state functionaries that really function under the Tsar. So when people will pull Lenin terms out of context, like they'll take like the Saliariat, which for Lenin are people who are dependent on the state for a salary, and just apply it to like everybody who is salaried, which all that is a way of time accounting.
Right, that becomes a way of just reifying hourly wages as opposed to salaries,
right?
As if that makes you a different category,
and also like it's just also a way of saying that the proletarian's always like poor in our society, which is not true. And also, Marx said explicitly was not the point. So I tend to be very careful with this, but there is a way in which historically it was this class of professional petite bourgeoisie who were independent contractors in modern parlance. That's not what they would have been called back then. They would have been called like professionals. That's what they would have been called. But we might think of them as like white collar contractors. That grouping and class of people were the primary people who had the leisure time and the skill sets to develop advanced socialist theory. And if you read the work of Edward Baring on vulgar Marxism and what it originally was, this class of people saw themselves as their primary job as the, quote, vanguard, was to merge with the advanced section of capital. I've talked about this before, advanced sections of capital. This is a word used by Marx. A lot of people tend to use, the Marxist humanists, for example, take advanced to mean the most oppressed. So like the oppressed people of color is who they think the advanced are. But it looks like from the context I've been able to figure out, they actually mean the most technically skilled, like the most skilled sections of capital, of the proletarian capital. So people who are not labor aristocratic but have high levels of skill set would join with the socialists who Marx knew did not primarily come out of the working class. He talks about this in the proletarian section of the preface to the Communist Manifesto. And proletarianization for Marx has two meanings. One, it means to be subject to the labor fund because you can no longer independently function. That's one thing of proletarianization. The other is voluntary proletarianization, throwing your lot in with the working class deliberately, and subordinating yourself and offering your skills to the working class. Now, many workerist anarchists have critiqued Marx and Marxists for this because clearly Marx wasn't working class. So the merger thesis is the idea that we have to merge with the advanced sections of the proletariat, and then that has to merge with the mass of the proletariat, and then that has to merge with the mass of the laboring classes. Now, I actually have argued, and I'm arguing a paper with Brandon Lightly that I'm writing probably for Cosmonaut Magazine, that the mass line is, for much as we make fun of it, and I think it actually ends up in the United States often being used for populist purposes, actually is a kind of Russian nesting doll formalization of the merger thesis, which was a nascent idea in the Second International and the First International. It is grounded in Marx, but has been really articulated by Lars Lee and Mike McNair.
I personally don't think that people should make fun of it at all.
Right.
Right. I think it's really weird that they do, actually.
Yeah. So the merger thesis for us means that parts of this new petite bourgeoisie are, I even kind of think of them as a petite bourgeoisie because so many of them are formerly semi-proletarianized, meaning that they're now dependent on a wage fund. A lot of them are on a government wage fund, which makes them kind of, it complicates their relationship to capital because they're technically not being exploited by capital. And you might go, what, really? Yeah, they kind of aren't, because they're being paid off of tax revenues, which are in addition to capital revenues. They're, in theory anyway, in classical political economy, that's tax revenues off the surplus. So where does that leave us? Well, there's a couple of things that we talk about. One is the lumpenization of the working class. So we need a merger thesis to help them, because the working class is often being de-skilled today. It is more isolated and more tied into the service sector. But we don't want to be like, hey, working class, just do what we say, because that's been a misinterpretation of vanguardism for a long time, both by people doing that and also by critics. And I'm going to turn it over to Daniel.
Yeah, I think one of the poor outcomes of contemporary class collaborationist politics, or kind of this general left populist détente with the bourgeois parties on the left, has been a kind of condescending model of engaging the lumpen, which I think the Democratic Party, for example, has a certain policy-oriented reliance, I think, on the passive sections of the working class, and that this often gets rerouted in certain sometimes pernicious, or perhaps we could say more charitably misleading characterizations of the contemporary proletariat. So we take on Gortz, the French philosopher, in his text Farewell to the Working Class, who argued that, in fact, the lumpen proletariat is the vanguard that we must lean on. We still see a lot of those kind of overtures to lumpen theory on the left today, although it kind of takes on different hues and has certain different agendas attached to it. We could talk a little bit how Varn and I theorize the lumpen proletariat as a process of immiseration and fragmentation that we need to take quite seriously. I think one of the problems here is like the social death and decay that is continuing to wreak havoc on the working class, and the need for a true appraisal of some of the really, really robust research that actually has been generated in academia, in anthropology, ethnography, and sociology of the working class, but which is often not read by socialists. So we touch upon some of that literature. It's unfortunate because a lot of the literature has a general political praxis, which is very, very mainstream liberal. So one of the parts of the book that I like is we're sort of asking, what would it mean to take that kind of like Engelsian, that early Engelsian condition of the working class questions quite seriously? How might socialist politics begin to do that is a big question that I think interests us in a certain way. A lot of that is curiously rerouted through therapeutic apparatuses and is sort of, I think, very much kind of concealed by social media, at least at the level of like the degradation and immiseration that is actually going on. So we feel that it's important for that to be centered and sort of focused on in a concerted way, not only through skilling and so on, and the problem of de-skilling, but also through things like culture. You know, what would that look like, right? At least in terms of how we prioritize a thinking of rejuvenating a kind of socialist-oriented culture, bringing back socialist realism. Why not, right? So that's a big focus there. And I don't know, Jason and Chris, if we touched on this whole PMC thing enough to your liking. I mean, we feel as if, in short, I would say most of the times in discourse, in debates, there's a strong tendency for highly reductive, just in the same way that the populist Manichean way of thinking about the people kind of hollows out these categories, that the PMC has grown kind of an unhelpful category. I think.
Yeah, very much so.
I mean, especially after Doge, right? And I live in Washington, D.C., and I saw, tens of thousands of government employees just get liquidated, right? And I realized something very interesting, which is that the political consciousness and kind of, dignity of labor for this class, if we want to call it a class, let's just call it a class for a moment, is so missing, so absent. We had an encampment. Nobody came. Nobody took to the streets. This was not a political event for this class. So I'm not sure even that they have a coherent ideological, because that's one of the presuppositions of PMC theory, of course, which is that they have this kind of like strong and coherent or unified ideological agenda. I'm not sure this is the case anymore.
Yeah.
I'm really not sure this is the case.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's been the case since the 1970s. I find it very fascinating when we talk about the PMC. We often what we really mean is people who annoy other professors at universities. If I'm being completely uncharitable, if I'm being more charitable, their image of the PMC are people that they have access to. So, for example, I pointed out that if I actually take the John and Barbara Ehrenreich of PMC, that thesis of PMC, like, why aren't we talking about the fire industry? That's finance, insurance, retail, and education. No, in engineering, excuse me, not education.
Or the other real PMC, the private military contractors.
Yeah, are all the private military contractors, and which, by the way, Burnham did talk about. He talked about them as the primary managerial core, not college graduates.
Well, you see, this is why PMC theory feeds back into moral panic, authoritarian populism, because it's about a fake idea of a unified superstructure of liberal bureaucrats who are the arbitrators or the kind of mediators of these cultural, and to some extent that's true. You know, the marketing industry and the NGO industry are in the business. You know, the MSNBC apparatus is in the business of creating kind of, like we see this with this ridiculous Graham Plattner, left populist figure, where he's now facing all of this kind of pseudo controversy.
Yeah,
that's a good example of a moral panic, you know. And so there is an element of the PMC that is in the business of furthering that, but that element is a tiny fraction, I would say, of the wider class.
Yeah. One thing that we might want to talk about with the service sector and lumpenization, and like why we focus so much on it, is both the left. There's a lot of left who appear to lumpen, and I want to be very clear that I'm not one of those people who argues that we should, like, you know, exclude the lumpenized. I'm gonna use it as a verb because I actually think it is better as a verb. Execute the lumpenized, because you see people talk about this. I think this is all kind of insane. But I do think there's a willful denial of the social pathologies of alienation and atomization in valorizing the lumpenized as a pure subject without change and incorporation into the proletariat. So, you know, I'm all about, like, incorporating former drug addicts. I mean, like, just to get into, maybe I'll speak for myself, but on biographical notes, I come from the blue collar working class primarily. Arguably, my mom makes it slightly more complicated because when I was 19, she became a nurse, but before that, she was a waitress. And every pathology of the lumpen is in my family. There's drug addiction, there's alcoholism, there's perpetual infidelity, perpetual partnerlessness. You know, I have a sibling who is unpartnered in his late 30s, and he's not asexual. It's not, you know, like a sexual preference issue. He is not really capable of being a partner in a stable way. And I find it, like, fascinating, the strata of, like, PMC debate. We talk about family abolition, and I'm just like, well, for most people in the working class, family has become a class good too. Daniel and I don't talk about it in this book. We'll probably talk about it in another one, but we've talked about it all over podcast for a while. And thus family abolition, no matter what you think about it, and it, you know, and its very limited 19th century meaning too, which, by the way, is very different than the way it's meant today, is almost perceived as a threat because of a non-dealing with what is happening to large sections of the working class from the strata that, by and large, does have stable families. Like,
right.
I mean, right. The irony of the people most advocating for family abolition in a kind of liberatory way, they're from a class that, by and large, is more likely, or from a strata of the class, let me be very careful, that is, by and large, more likely to be married and to not have more than, like, 1 or 2 divorces. So right. I find this very interesting when we look at how we deal with this, because descriptions of the lumpen as it was understood as a social category in the 19th century, one thing that I noticed in reading, like, the same, liberal sociological work and education, I think specifically of a book that's now 20 years old, which is Ruby Klein's Framework for Understanding Class and Education. And it talks about the underclass. It doesn't use the term lumpen, but that's what it means. And it talks about, the cultural associations and pathologies with that group. And if you look at them in 1990 and then look at what we're talking about today, you will see these cultural associations and pathologies far up the income ladder than you would when Reuben Pay was writing. And that kind of got me thinking about this problem, and also reading Claude Barreau's book. And it's one of the things that Daniel and I first kind of came together on, was trying to deal with the lumpenized without pretending they were a coherent class, which they're not, and without morally shaming them or excluding them from politics, but also without like, oh, we can use them easily as a revolutionary subject, because that doesn't make sense. Right. But you do see
valorizing, the beautiful soul kind of politics. Yeah, it's tough. It's also tough because too, there's also a certain alienation, I think, for the working class, given that lumpenization is so far-reaching, that it becomes a problem that ideally should that the working class needs resources to adequately handle on their own terms, as opposed to this paternalistic model of these kind of charity models, or the charity model or the welfare model. That would be something that I think could forge a type of reparative intra-working class politics that would be super essential for clarifying the kind of root of class antagonisms that fragment and frankly stow a lot of small-scale resentment that depoliticizes the working class overall. I've seen, I think Derick and I probably are collaborating together because we have that autobiographical experience of seeing these dynamics up close, and the kind of whiplash that comes from going from there and then moving into a academic environment where these classes are kind of talked about in abstractions that are very detached from actually how these things are lived out day to day in a certain way. So there's that element to it. I think the other element, though, is the sense that I think we agree with Barrow that right-wing Trump, the right-wing populism, has its own seductive way that is actually quite successful in terms of seizing the lumpen question. So you see both left and right populism has a certain way of seducing the lumpen. And socialists needs to develop a different way of seduction is, I think, the main thing we would try to argue here. So you see there's something kind of systematic about our project whereby we see populism appear as this symptom in all of these different spheres of political thought. It's not just like in class.
To me, I always hear people say, well, the answer to this is a communist party, to which I say, of course, but everybody says that.
Right, it's everybody's answer to every question. So that is
Debsian socialism. If that's the answer, then I agree with the answer.
Right.
Well, right. So on that, it's like the real question then is about how do you merge something which on both ends doesn't really exist?
So. That is a good question, isn't it? Because we're calling for a merger thesis for a professional class that is being proletarianized, but yet, and this is important because the reason why we still refer to them as a new petite bourgeoisie is all their institutions, universities, civic organizations, professional organizations, all still basically operate and produce a habitus, to use a Bedouin term that might be problematic for Marxists, but I'm going to use it anyway. That is petite bourgeois, and people who half of whom are not, right? They're on the wage fund. But you see this in like the way teachers organize. I kept on getting super mad at my own union. I'm a union rep because I kept on like, we don't need to be treated like gas station attendants. And I'm like, fuck you. Yes, we do. I will be, for me, it is not because I have an education that makes me special. Sure, that's cool and all. But I've known plenty of gas station attendants who are perfectly fucking educated. I've also known plenty who are dog shit not. I mean, that's not the point. Like, but you still have this illusion for teachers whom have not been petite bourgeois for like a century. All right? Really. But they still think of themselves as a profession that is above the rest of the class. And they talk that way. And they get sympathy for doing so. Because God forbid you be a poor service worker. And where I'm like, no, man, I'm not throwing the gas station attendant under the bus, right? Like, I'm just not. They're not that different from me, but for the grace of history go I. So,
I mean, we might all be gas station attendants, all of us that are engaged in the teaching profession.
Yeah, that's also true.
You know,
I mean, yeah. As a person who is in education, and like being told by my boss to use AI all the time, and also has already been pushed into an online school that's literally now at this point, even though it's a public school, it's not a charter. It's funded normally. There's none of those issues are here in this case, but like we're probably going to start costing teachers jobs.
I mean, one thing you could do is you could enroll in the RCIA, and then we get confirmed as Catholic, and then
convert to Catholicism and have a religious exemption.
Yeah.
So that's funny. So I mean, I do think right now we have to have a very broad conception of this. And one thing that Daniel and I like talk a lot about, like, for example, people asked us a lot about tenant organizations. We're probably, again, we're flirting with writing a second book, maybe, and this might come in terms of social reproduction. The reason why tenants organizations is really appealing to a lot of people is it has a very low bar of entry, and it's practically civic. Now, I want to say structurally there are some problems with it if you think it's the same thing as a normal union, because denying property owners rent does not actually end their capital claim. They own the property. They can still get loans and stuff from it. They don't actually need you as much as the bourgeois needs the worker. And because property is a part of the relations of production, it's also tied to state law. So you cannot really independently stand outside of legal functions and do things without the state intervening in your behalf if you're a tenants union, where you can as a traditional pre-NCLB union. But I still support tenants union pretty strongly because it starts building those ties of civil society and thinking of your community as a class community and not just a community where you live that might have community interests that are geographic. Well, no, the tenants unions get you thinking about community interest as also classed in the mode of production and relations of production. So we are critically supportive of those kinds of things because of the civil society problem. We're also I know that I am. Actually, I haven't talked to Daniel about this, of stuff like pre-majority union and working class social organizations that are not explicitly political, because we need mediations for this, and this can be tied back into the political, because one of the things that we've always thought about is like, yeah, sure, I need a party. How the fuck do I get from here to there without becoming a sect if all I have to do is say party? Because everyone's done that. Yeah. There's been like 100 different parties, even in the last 20 years, that have come and gone in a blink of an eye that never get above like between 500 and 6,000 people. And we don't like, that's just a hobby. It's not even LARPing. It's like sub-LARP. So
it aspires to be LARPing.
Yeah, it aspires to be LARPing. So it's like the people sitting on the ground building the LARP rules and they never get to play it. And so we're trying to figure out if we take this problem of populism seriously and we say, okay, look, we're gonna just say, let's not do this again. What are the implications? This is a very short book. We can't actually answer them all. But what are the implications of what this strategy will look like? And it does look like rebuilding a proletarian civic and cultural movement that people like me and Daniel and people downwardly mobile from these other, strata, because Daniel and I are also, we're upwardly mobile into the new petit bourgeoisie. Most of the people around us are going in the opposite direction.
The further I get along in my education and work, the poorer I get. So I think I'm the other end.
Exactly. And there's going to be a lot more of them. And just statistically speaking, if you think you can do this off the industrial proletariat, the problem that you have is even in the developing world, the industrial proletariat is less than 20% of the population. And in the developed world, it's like 9 to 13.
Yeah. I don't know how can you succinctly sum up the call that your book makes, not just the diagnosis, but the call.
Well, I've started Protracted People's War in the DSA. One thing I would say is like we need to start letting the liberals being the only people doing the sociology. Like
Sure.
the class for itself isn't good enough without understanding what a class in itself is. I also think we are going to have to resist both the siren calls of identitarian, including worker identitarianism, like workerism, because that tends to actually render worker politics as a passive identity itself, weirdly. And even though it claims to like be beyond that what it really reduces people to is like a cluster of sociological facts that are tied into working classness. For that means positively, we do need to start building institutions to which organic intellectuals can emerge, and people who are not so organic can choose to throw their lot in and not just shame them for being PMC or whatever, because that's not particularly helpful anyway. And oddly enough, as we both implied, most of the people doing that are themselves in that strata of society. Yeah. And also this idea that they were so culturally ubiquitous that they would just like dominate whatever observation. It took Elon Musk a month to break their backs institutionally.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even recognized as such, many by people in that strata. So that's important, and we need to do that. But that means we need to start pushing for class independent organizations, not just a class independent party, class independent organizations, and that we have to remember that just being popular does not actually make you a political subject. And so we have to orient ourselves towards building a competent political subject that isn't just the political subject because it's a victim. Because at the end of the day, yes, we care about victimhood. Yes, we care about bad things happening to people. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but that the proletariat isn't the political subject, if there is one at all, because it suffers. All kinds of fucking people suffer. Even the bourgeois sometimes suffer. That's not the point. The point is they at least historically have, and we still think that they, to some degree, still do, the ability to reproduce society at its material basis. And because of that, also, since they're not really structurally implicated in the ownership of that reproduction, that they can actually lead us out of this class situation. But to do that, we have to admit where they are, what they're doing, how they are, and not just talk about it on ideal terms, which I guess means that we have to engage in a sociological and civic project as much as a political one, because without the sociological and civic projects, we don't have a political project to launch. And that also means, though, I think wrestling categories back from liberals. Like, one thing that frustrates me about like Jacobin, they do a lot of good research on this stuff, but they conflate liberal and Marxist categories all the time. Like, and they don't try to correct for them. They don't like say, here we're using a liberal definition of working class, but that we mean doesn't have a college education. And here we're using an income base, and here we're using a base of production. They just use the word for all of it. And we actually do have to be fairly rigorous on both setting up the conditions of who joins us, but also on how we analyze it, because liberal categories about class really aren't ours. And they might help us understand things, but they're not what we're talking about.
Right.
I hope that helps. It doesn't seem like I'm giving you actionable anything, but
It's a very compelling book, and I would definitely recommend that people, read it, especially with those last couple of comments in mind. That there's, it should feel like an opening. That's rather than the final word on a question. And even despite my what I might call minor disagreements and Varn might call major disagreements, I think Daniel, you had said maybe, I don't know, a little while back, you had said hopefully we've convinced you of I don't know, the main thesis. Anyways, I would say yeah, I think you have, and I think as anybody who is wondering about it should start here.
And we will have links to Varn's and Daniel's projects, as well as to where to buy the book in the show notes. So I guess that concludes things. Everyone, go check out those links. Thank you, Derick and Daniel, for thank you so much for your time.
Рабочие и крестьяне не смогут прожить без нас. Без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, тянуть труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.